Welcome to the Cheating Wife Stories channel. My name is Robert, 53 years old. I have been living in the state of Maryland for almost 3 decades now and work as a lawyer in a small firm. I take my work seriously. I'm used to scrutinizing every detail, poring over documents, and seeking out inconsistencies. Once upon a time, this brought me genuine pride, for defending a client's interests felt like an incredible mental challenge. With the years came experience, and some routine emptiness replaced that initial passion. I look at piles of papers, dozens of contracts, lawsuits, letters. On the table, under a wooden stand, lie printed copies of new judicial practices. I didn't finish reading them, so I put them aside. I never planned to abandon my profession. It provides for me and my family. My wife, Dorothy, is 11 years younger than I am. We married when she was 30, and my 40th birthday was just around the corner. She taught foreign literature at a local college. She enjoyed giving her students interesting texts, discussing their work, and organizing open debates. Perhaps she was more cheerful than I, often laughing when our friends gathered for barbecues or evening chats by the fireplace. I usually sat a little apart, sipping coffee or juice, and pondering my projects. Our son grew up and left for the West long ago. He lives in California, calls occasionally, and delights in his independence. I can't say I feel any emptiness about it, more a quiet satisfaction that he is forging his own path and knows how to handle difficulties. Perhaps someday I'd like to see him and my grandchildren more often. But the reality is that the family, which once seemed an unshakable fortress, has now taken on a different tone. It's just the two of us, and everyday life has turned gray. Sometimes Dorothy tries to involve me in discussions about trips or outings. She suggests that on weekends we go out to a nearby town, visit a farmer's market, or engage in charity work. I murmur something like, "We'll think about it," and sink back into my routine. We own a country house in a quiet spot not far from the Chesapeake Bay. In the past, we would only drive there a couple of times a year, mainly in the fall, to stroll by the water. But last spring I decided, I'll take a vacation and take my wife there for a couple of weeks. She had long been waiting for such a reset. And so that little house turned into our almost permanent refuge. We started staying there more often on weekends. A wooden porch, old furniture, and a slightly dilapidated fence on one side. On the other side, the fence adjoined the garden of our close friend Frank, with whom we've been friends for about 10 years. He is now 54. He lost his wife even before I met him, and has been living alone ever since. Frank is a sturdy man with a neatly trimmed short beard, and he often bursts into laughter when we get together. He once worked as a mechanic in an auto repair shop, saved some money, and moved to this area for his retirement. On his property, he keeps an old ATV and loves repairing equipment that neighbors bring him. Trimmers, lawnmowers, even small chainsaws. Whenever we visited, he always helped out. Sometimes he would patch the roof or fix the plumbing. I remember we celebrated my last birthday at this country house. That evening, Frank prepared the meat. I joked that Dorothy was delighted. She smiled, impressed by his skill at the grill and his lighthearted nature. I had never noticed any danger in that. We were like family. No hidden agendas or secrets. Every morning I wake up early. My body aches from a sedentary lifestyle, so I do a light warm-up. On the day we decided to settle permanently in the house, I stepped out onto the porch with a thermos of coffee. The air smelled of pine, and birds chirped in the branches. I watched the work of spring nature. Everything was turning green. Leaves rustled. Then I heard the creak of a gate, and Frank appeared on our property in faded jeans. "Hey, buddy, I thought I'd check in on you. I figured you might need a couple of tools," he proclaimed, waving his hand. "Hello, good to see you. We're just settling in," I replied. I escorted him to the shed where we planned to clear out some old junk. Frank peered inside, shook his head, pulled a small knife from his pocket, and immediately started cutting off a piece of branch that had slipped through a gap. We exchanged a few words about business, recalling how he once helped repair a pump. Then he asked me to say hello to Dorothy and left through our gate to his place. I didn't pay any mind to the way she peeked out of the window, smiling slightly as she watched him leave. Everything seemed ordinary. A week later, I began noticing that Frank and Dorothy were spending long hours under a canopy in the garden with a cup of tea when I left on business. Although my workplace is in the city, sometimes I had to travel, meet with clients, or sign documents at the office. I would return in the evening to see that they continued their conversation. Sometimes Frank would be chopping wood while Dorothy stood by, handing him water, his hearty laugh or smile. And yet they would part ways whenever I stepped into the yard, as if not wanting to disturb my rest. I didn't see anything criminal in it. We had long been a trio, and I had always enjoyed that friendship. A seed of doubt was planted when I noticed them exchanging knowing glances during our three-person conversations. I'm observant by trade, of course, but I dismissed it then. Perhaps it's just my imagination. Once, Dorothy had made an interesting dessert, served me some, then took a piece on a plate and went over to Frank. I followed her and saw them laughing by the fence. He reached out, as if casually touching her shoulder. Before, his touches had seemed friendly. Now something in my mind was alarmed. One evening I stood by the window. Dorothy had already gone to sleep. Outside the fence there was some indistinct noise. Perhaps Frank was fiddling with his belongings. The clouds hid the moon, and it had grown dark on the property. As a lawyer, I usually rely on facts and try not to indulge in suppositions. I knew a person might just be doing his usual things. Yet a feeling of unease, or rather, wariness, flickered by. A fleeting beam of a car's headlight slid past the window. I stayed at the window, reassuring myself. There's no reason to panic. And yet the thought that Dorothy might be discussing something personal with the neighbor without me lingered. Even after several weeks of living at the country house, I began to notice small details. For instance, my wife more and more often mentioned that Frank was an expert in various household matters. He's such a handyman, and talking with him is always interesting, she would say at breakfast. There was no suspicious tone in her voice, but it seemed to me that something more lay hidden behind those words, and yet I continued to embrace her. We still slept together. True, intimacy occurred very rarely, as if our closeness was being drained by monotony. In the evenings we sat in the living room. I read a new legal article while she browsed news on her phone or read study materials for her students. Each of us lived in our own world. One day, she suggested throwing a small celebration in honor of our wedding anniversary. I agreed. We bought groceries, invited Frank and several neighbors. A sunny morning arrived on the day of the celebration. Dorothy set the table on the veranda and arranged beautiful dishes. I poured the drinks, then went to call Frank, who was busy with his grill. We merged our yards and decided. Every guest could roam wherever they liked. On the table, there were salads, a hot dish, a box of pastries. Our acquaintances brought homemade baked goods. Someone even brought fish that Frank had salted himself. People began to gather, laugh, chat. The music played softly. I walked among the guests, nodding and making small talk. Dorothy looked charming in a light pastel-colored dress, standing out in the crowd with her poise and quiet allure. Frank's gaze repeatedly lingered on her. He seemed more nervous than usual. For the first time it occurred to me that this party might have a different significance for him. Later, when the guests had left, only a few remained. The closest circle. We gathered some firewood and built a bonfire. Cognac appeared. Someone got tipsy and laughed louder than before. Frank stepped aside and leaned against our birch tree. My wife rushed to grab a blanket, intending to cover her shoulders. I watched everything, feeling the mounting tension inside. Dorothy approached him. I could hear their voices. She smiled and said something about money for repairing our house. He leaned toward her ear and replied quietly. The shadow from the fire danced on the ground, and I noticed his hand clench her palm ever so slightly before she rejoined the circle. At that moment I realized You can't mistake it. None of our friends touches someone else's wife the way Frank did. My heart skipped a beat. I jumped up, went into the middle of the yard, and tossed some firewood. The smoke stung my eyes and throat. Dorothy and Frank came closer. Their faces remained calm, but there were sparks in their eyes. I thought, this isn't the time to start a scandal in front of our friends. But I've been turning a blind eye for too long. Nevertheless, I kept silent. The evening ended without any loud quarrels. The other guests left. Frank and I cleared up the dishes. He went back to his place under the cover of darkness. Instead of complaining about being tired and going to bed, Dorothy sat on the porch swing, staring blankly into space. I approached and asked if she was cold. She merely shook her head and replied, "Everything's fine. I just need to rest." There was a strange intonation in her voice, as if she didn't quite understand what was going on inside her. I woke up the next morning with a sore back. Dorothy was sitting in the kitchen, scrolling through emails on her laptop, drinking lukewarm green tea. I said, "Maybe we should go to town today and have dinner somewhere." She looked at me with a lost expression and replied that she had a couple of errands to run, and maybe later. Her distraction astonished me. Although her tone was lightly polite, it felt as if she were absorbed in her own thoughts. I didn't press her. The thought that my suspicions were not unfounded crept into my mind, but I decided to give it time before accusing her. I knew all too well the consequences of making unfounded accusations. That same day, I sat on the porch, opened my laptop, and answered some business emails. Dorothy passed by along the path and knocked on the neighbor's gate. Frank opened it and said, "Yes, come in, of course." I caught a glimpse of her as she headed into his house. Half an hour passed, then an hour, then another. In the twilight, she returned and said that they had been talking about our fence and some common plans. I nodded, trying to hide my disbelief, and asked why it took so long. She shrugged, saying she got sidetracked by a conversation about literature. A phone call had come in, and she had to help. It didn't seem criminal, but inside me a sphere of anxiety grew larger. The strangest thing was that before I would have asked her not to spend so much time at the neighbors, she would have explained, and we would have found a compromise. But now I kept my mouth shut. Perhaps I was stopped by shame. After all, he's my friend. It feels strange to suspect a friend of encroaching on my wife. We had always been close enough, and my work had trained me to look for evidence before making accusations. But my heart wouldn't lie. Something serious was brewing. I began to notice how Dorothy's expression softened when she spoke of Frank. She mentioned what a good conversationalist he was, how lonely he felt. I tried to steer away from such discussions. Foolish pride whispered, "Don't make a scene. You're a grown man. Don't disgrace yourself." And yet I recorded every movement, including fleeting smiles. Eventually, one detail struck me hard. A few days after that memorable party, Dorothy stopped asking me for help around the house. Before, she always said, "Could you move that bag of fertilizer?" Or, "Please lift that chair onto the veranda." Now she would text Frank, and within minutes he would appear in our yard, ready to unload the truck or fix a broken chair. He would grab his tools and go with her to the garage. And I sat in the living room listening to their voices outside, the distant rustling, the cheerful laughter. It was as if I had been pushed to the background, and I had no doubt left. Something was terribly wrong. I tried to remain calm and switched back to work, making calls to employees, reading case law, meeting with clients. My friends in the city noticed I had become curt. I brushed it off, saying it was just autumn fatigue. Deep down, a darkness was already forming. Yet I stubbornly avoided the conversation. I feared that one day my words would slip, and I wouldn't be able to stop a torrent of hurtful expressions, as often happens when emotions run high. Often I would get in my car and drive to the supermarket or a clerk's office just to avoid being an extra spectator in this strange atmosphere. I still hoped that my wife would remain faithful, and that Frank would understand the boundary he was crossing if his affections went too far. Perhaps I was mistaken. Soon I would find out. A thunderclap struck in the quietest week of October. The morning seemed as usual. A cool wind blew, and leaves rustled underfoot. I woke up and saw that Dorothy was not in bed. I stepped onto the porch and found no sign of her. The kitchen was empty, and so was the living room. I noticed the car was still parked, meaning she hadn't gone to town. I walked through the yard and peeked behind the old shed. No one. Finally, I heard her voice coming from the neighbor's side. She was speaking in an excited, indistinct manner. I quietly approached the fence. I knocked on the picket, calling, "Dorothy, are you there?" She immediately emerged into the light, her face slightly flushed. Frank followed her, holding some key in his hand. My wife explained that they were fiddling with a rusty lock, trying to open a storage room. I nodded without a word of reproach. I invited her to join me for breakfast. There were a couple of important matters I had to attend to, and I wanted to share the morning meal with her. She nodded in agreement and hurried after me, glancing back at Frank over her shoulder. At the table I started a conversation. "I see you spend a lot of time with him. Do you enjoy spending so many hours at his house?" She feigned surprise. "Why not? We're friends, and many respect him. Yes, I spend a couple of hours there when I need tools or repair advice." I suggested, "Next time, invite me along. We can handle it together." She hesitated for a moment, then, looking away, said, "Of course, whenever it's convenient for you." At that moment my phone rang. I went out onto the veranda to answer a client call. The conversation lasted more than half an hour. When I returned to the kitchen, Dorothy was gone. On the table lay a plate with the remains of an omelette, a cup of cold tea, and beside it a clean sheet of paper on which she had written a few words saying she would be back by lunch. She had left without further explanation. The day passed tensely. I tried to concentrate on work, but my thoughts kept circling around one question. Why were my relations with my wife taking on such a murky tint? Never before had she run off to the neighbors in the morning without warning. Perhaps she had grown tired of our life, or perhaps it was mere curiosity. I didn't want to shout or create a humiliating scene, but the silence was suffocating. Later in the evening, Dorothy returned. Her lips curved into a smile and her eyes sparkled, like when a woman delights in an unexpected gift. I asked what her mood was about. She just shrugged. I suggested taking a walk along the bay shore. She declined, citing fatigue. I didn't insist. Soon an event occurred that tore at my nerves. A waterworks employee arrived to check the meters. I decided to deal with the paperwork with him and left our guest at the doorstep to fetch a folder. When I returned, the visitor was standing with a smile and saying, "You have a wonderful wife. I saw her the other day in a cafe with the neighbor. They were chatting so cordially that I got a bit envious. A chill ran down my spine. It turned out they had gone to a cafe together, and I hadn't had any idea." I thanked the young man for his concern and escorted him to the meters. Inside, it felt as if a tight string had snapped within me. The next morning, I finally resolved. When Dorothy came out of the bedroom, I waited for her in the kitchen and said, "We need to talk. Is everything all right, Dorothy? I notice your mood is very changeable. Please explain why you spend so much time alone with Frank." She lifted her chin as if offended. "Am I supposed to report to you? Am I not allowed to discuss repair issues? He's friendly, and I feel more at ease when he's around to help." And that trip to the cafe, was that also a repair discussion? I couldn't hold back. She frowned and looked away. "I just wanted to have a few words with him. And you were busy with your legal work, so I decided to have a coffee in town. What's strange about that?" I tried to choose my words carefully. "Maybe it's nothing, but please don't keep me in the dark. I'm worried." Dorothy waved her hand dismissively. "No secrets. Don't exaggerate. I'm sorry if I hurt you." The conversation ended, though the tension only grew. That very day we were supposed to head out to meet one of my business partners, but Dorothy pretended that she had suddenly gotten a headache and stayed home. When I returned late in the evening, I noticed that the fence had once again been left open to the neighbor's lot. Frank's house had lights on. My wife sat in the living room, reading a magazine, greeting me with a casual hello. I nodded, passed her by, and didn't even ask any questions. I was exhausted. That became the catalyst. My inner suspicion grew to a scale that could no longer be ignored. I planned to take decisive steps before the situation spiraled out of control. Autumn was gradually giving way to colder weather. Leaves withered and fell, and the wind turned chill. I became hypervigilant, developing my own kind of investigation. I watched my wife, trying to catch something hidden in her actions. And indeed, the details each day revealed a frightening picture. One day a neighbor from the other end of the settlement wandered up, carrying a misdelivered letter. He asked if we had seen Frank. Apparently, he had taken to remodeling his garage and had called for help. I pretended not to care, saying I didn't know where he was. Deep down I understood that Frank had invited someone else, so he must have been busy with some work. And what was Dorothy doing during that time? She seemed to have vanished, nowhere to be seen on the property or in the house. My heart clenched. Cautiously, I headed to Frank's garage. I quietly skirted around a long row of thuja, stood at the corner. Through the slightly ajar door, I saw my wife standing by a workbench, pressed up against Frank, while he was kissing her neck. In his hands were work gloves, his hair disheveled, his breathing heavy. Dorothy bit her lips silently, and her hands slid over his back. My head spun. Blood rushed in my ears, and I saw it clearly. This is it. I froze, holding my breath, not daring to move. My heart pounded like a hammer on an anvil. Seconds seemed like hours. Frank lifted her, set her at the edge of the workbench. She threw her arms around his shoulders. Their kisses grew more passionate, his hands gliding along her hips. She moaned softly, pressing her whole body against him. I felt anger ignite within me, mixed with humiliation. A cold, chilling terror pierced my chest. My wife, my very own woman, with whom I had shared years, was now giving herself to my longtime friend, unaware that I was watching them just a meter away from the door. At that moment, someone walked behind the fence. Footsteps were heard. Dorothy and Frank startled, pausing for a moment. He glanced outside and motioned with his hand for her to stay put. I quickly backed away, hiding behind some bushes. I didn't want to be caught spying. After the footsteps subsided, a minute passed, and I heard muffled sounds. They resumed what they had been doing. I don't recall how long I stood in that paralyzing state, seconds or minutes. My mind battled with the urge to burst in and confront them. But I restrained myself. Perhaps fear of a scandal and the realization that I wouldn't win this battle easily paralyzed me. I didn't know whether to explode in rage or wait until I gathered even more evidence of betrayal. The sound of her quiet moans tore at my soul, and his suppressed exhales sounded like slaps. Finally, I retreated from the garage and went back home. I locked myself in the bedroom. All I could think was, my life has crumbled, and I did nothing. I sat on the bed, clenching my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. My face burned. Gradually, the pain transformed into a cold fury. That evening, Dorothy returned, smiled at me, and pretended that the day had passed without incident. I nodded in response, not even asking where she had been. I slammed the bathroom door, turned on the water, trying to drown out the thought that not long ago she had lain in another man's arms. The water flowed, and images thundered in my head. Her raised hips, his greedy kisses. It was a physical betrayal without any mitigating excuses. They boldly decided that I would never uncover their secret, or perhaps they no longer cared if I found out. The next day, I ambushed the moment when Frank was heading to the grocery store. I knocked on his door, but it was locked. I returned home. The house was silent. Dorothy emerged from the shower, her hair still wet, a robe on her shoulders. An ordinary domestic scene, if not for my knowledge of their passionate encounter. I spoke, Would you care to explain where you disappeared to yesterday? She looked embarrassed, as if not expecting such a direct question. I was talking with the neighbor. There's a lot to do on the property. I gritted my teeth, trying not to succumb to the urge to scream. And that's all I managed to say, looking her straight in the eyes. She tried to offer an evasive answer, but before she could finish, my phone vibrated. I answered. It was a client, urgently requesting that I come sign a contract. I had to leave, even though I was boiling inside. I rushed to the city, contemplating my next steps. A downpour of rains began in my soul. I realized I couldn't continue living as if nothing had changed. They had crossed a line, but I chose a cold strategy. I decided to gather additional evidence. I felt like a detective investigating someone else's marriage. I scored Dorothy's phone while she slept, but found no explicit messages. Perhaps they had arranged things verbally. Possibly their relationship was built on long-standing friendship, and they didn't use messengers. However, in her notes I found an entry where she had jotted down meeting times with him, planning to help F with the garage or collect tools. Clearly, these moments coincided with my trips to the office. The moment came when I realized I wasn't going to tolerate this any longer. I had to determine just how deeply they were entangled in their mutual passion. The morning was dreary, with wet, clinging snow on the branches. That evening, Dorothy said we should go to town to buy something for repairs. I pretended to agree, but at dawn I started the car and quietly drove off, saying I had an urgent call. In reality, I parked a couple of blocks away, then returned home on foot, hiding under a maple tree near Frank's property. About an hour later, she stepped out through the gate, looked around, and headed toward him. They had evidently agreed that I wouldn't be there. I crept to a window on the garden side. There were old curtains, and through a gap in the glass I could see part of the living room. I froze. Soon, they appeared in the room, embraced, and melted into a long kiss. My wife unbuttoned her sweater slightly, revealing a lacy bra. Frank stroked her waist and let his hand drop lower. She sighed, clinging tighter to him. Rage clouded my vision. I nearly burst in and barged in. But the smug look on Frank's face and the submissive behavior of Dorothy held me back. They disappeared from sight, apparently moving into the bedroom. I heard muffled sounds, the thumping of a cabinet, a woman's voice. I could no longer continue my spying. I withdrew, nearly slipping on the damp grass. In my chest, there was a hollow emptiness that soon turned into determination. It was time to act. They had crossed every boundary. Days dragged painfully on. I realized that continuing to exist in this pretense was unacceptable. I had to expose the truth and force them to confront my suspicions. But a darker plan had also taken root. My anger had morphed into vengeful malice. I imagined the look of horror on their faces when I told them that I was fully aware of their secrets. I mentally staged scenarios of exposure. I'll catch you in the act, drag you out into the street, and hurl accusations in your faces. But that seemed too simple, too straightforward. I'm not one to scream my anger across the neighborhood. I prefer cold, calculated actions. One evening, Dorothy, seemingly tired of my sullen mood, approached me. "What's wrong with you lately? You're not talking, hardly sleeping, not eating. Did something serious happen at work?" I laughed harshly. "And you have no idea. Look around you." She tensed, noticing my clenched fists, and stepped back. A shadow of apprehension crossed her face. But I said nothing more. She was silent. I felt the fragile veneer of calm beginning to crack. The next day, I saw a calendar in Dorothy's dresser where she marked her cycle. I read her notes and realized she had been late for her period for a long time. We had lived together long enough to deduce that the chances of pregnancy were very high. A cold shiver ran through me. Could it be that she was pregnant by Frank? I decided to broach the subject delicately. At dinner I asked, "Don't you want to check on your health? You seem so distracted lately." Dorothy flinched, setting down her fork. "What health? I'm fine, Robert. A nervous note tinged her voice. Maybe you should see a doctor. I've noticed your energy is gone. Your appetite has fallen. She understood what I was hinting at, and her expression grew tense. She averted her eyes and muttered that she would decide when to visit a doctor. The conversation reached an impasse. The next morning I headed into town, swiftly taking care of business, and stopped by our acquaintance, a doctor, to ask if Dorothy had come for a consultation. No, she hadn't. That confirmed that she was playing her silent game. Dark thoughts swirled in my mind. Are they trying to hide a pregnancy? Or is she not even sure whose child it is? That evening I became more decisive. I went into a pharmacy, bought a test, and left it on the table for her, saying, "Check yourself." She froze and paled. "What is that for?" "You'll see," I replied harshly. Half an hour later she emerged from the bathroom, expression blank, holding the test. She said, "It seems positive." Her voice trembled, tears welled up in her eyes. I rose from my chair and said, "And what now? Will you tell me to whom you owe this?" She blushed, bit her lip, and softly murmured, "It's yours. Don't lie." I roared, causing her to recoil. "Do you think I'm blind? Stop pretending to be naive." She lowered her eyes, her lips trembling. I don't know the exact dates, but maybe I had an affair." Before she could finish, I grabbed a cup from the table and hurled it against the wall. Shards splintered in every direction. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed. I leaned over her, feeling the surge of anger fill me like a steel blade. "Finally, you admitted it. Too late. I saw you with Frank. More than once. You've betrayed our marriage, and he, my so-called friend, took away what was most precious to me. How could you?" I erupted into a wild scream, and she dropped her head onto her knees and began trembling. Then she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It just happened suddenly." A sphere of malice burst inside me. I knew I could do something terrible at that moment, but I held myself back from physical violence. I only said, "Pack your things, or go to him." She lifted her gaze. "Robert, please, let's talk calmly. I never wanted to destroy our family. You hadn't shown any interest in me for a long time. And then Frank came along. He understood my thoughts. And it all went too far. But this child, maybe it's yours." Those words of false consolation sounded repulsive. I strode to the door, growled without looking back. "Get ready, period." I dashed out of the house, slamming the front door so hard that the glass rattled. I headed toward the neighbor's gate. Inside me roiled a grim satisfaction. At last, an open conflict. I intended to confront Frank with a fistfight. I approached his gate. It was locked. I knocked. Silence. That damned coward had either disappeared or pretended there was no one. I furiously tugged at the bolt, but got no response. I had no choice but to leave, so as not to cause a ruckus throughout the neighborhood or summon the police. When I returned, I saw Dorothy hastily packing her things into a small bag. Our eyes met briefly, and I felt a cold disdain. She walked silently out the door, passing me by. On the threshold, she turned and said, "Forgive me." I said nothing, merely watching her leave. Dark days followed. Anger, humiliation, wounded pride, all merged into one. But gradually, from the murky pain, a clear plan emerged. Being a lawyer, I knew how lawsuits work, how divorces are processed, and how to hit a person both morally and financially. Yet that was not enough. I craved a more excruciating revenge. Dorothy did not return at night, and throughout the next day, she was nowhere to be seen. She likely moved in with Frank. I stalked both of them when I went into town, but for several days they managed to avoid me, trying to hide. The more they did, the more repulsed I became. She was trying to hide her pregnancy, and he was afraid of meeting me. One evening at sunset, I saw Frank's window with the two of them inside. He was embracing her, stroking her shoulders, perhaps consoling her. The curtains were quickly drawn, as if they sensed my gaze. That night, tormented by thoughts, I wandered around the yard. Memories of distant youth surfaced when I had encountered the betrayal of a business partner. Then my reaction was cold and uncompromising. But now it was much harder. This involved my wife, my home, years of life, and this unborn child who likely wasn't mine. My hands clenched into fists. How dare they steal my years, my trust? At the same time, I began formulating a plan to destroy their world, to strip them of the ground beneath their feet. Frank had his own home and savings. He had no direct heirs. If I could manage to accuse him of ruining my marriage, there was a chance to file a civil lawsuit for moral damages. Once in some states, there exists the concept of alienation of affection, a suit against the person who destroyed someone else's family bonds. Although the practice is complicated, I was convinced that with the right approach, I could strike a serious blow. Additionally, I had contacts in the tax office. Frank likely didn't always declare his income when fixing equipment for neighbors. I figured that, if desired, he could be subjected to an audit. As I drew up my plan, a devilish satisfaction pounded within me. Didn't you think, Frank and Dorothy, that I would uncover your scheme? For a week I avoided meeting them, sending divorce papers through my lawyer instead. Dorothy received a summons for a hearing. She called me twice, pleading for a meeting, but I hung up on her. Then Frank called. "Listen, Robert, let's talk. This can't go on like this. I'm sorry that things turned out this way." I shoved the phone to my ear and snapped, "See you in court. And get ready for audits. I'll do everything to make you answer for this." A couple of days later, I noticed that Frank's house looked shabby. Leaves on the porch, his energetic, owner-like gait nowhere in sight. Apparently, a nervous atmosphere reigned inside. Perhaps Dorothy was indeed pregnant and suffering from morning sickness, or maybe they both were in a panic. It only fueled my desire to finish them off. But my final revenge lay on another level. I knew that sometimes the fear of public disgrace breaks a person more than any legal fees ever could, and I decided to hit their reputation hard. I gathered photographs. I took several shots showing them embracing in the yard while I hid behind trees. I added my own comments hinting at a child conceived in adultery. I sent these materials via email to several of our mutual acquaintances. I stoked rumors that Frank had picked up my wife when she was vulnerable. Some of them, as I had predicted, spread gossip throughout the neighborhood. A few days later, a friend from our fishing trips called me. "Robert, are you serious? They say the armor in your family has cracked, and you're ready to tear everything to shreds. People are talking. I see you've really taken this on." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "Yes, I'm glad the truth has come out." Meanwhile, time moved toward the divorce hearing. I was certain the decision would be in my favor. Dorothy would not be able to claim any of my property, and I would refuse to pay alimony for her child if it wasn't mine, demanding genetic testing instead. I might not receive direct monetary compensation for the betrayal, but at least I would save a lot of money by not letting her snatch half of it. Soon, Dorothy called. "Please, listen. I'm 3 months pregnant. The doctor says that by the dates it could be your child, not ruled out. I beg you not to take everything away from me. If there's a chance that the baby is yours," I replied in an icy voice, "we'll do a DNA test, and if it turns out it's not mine, forget I ever existed. But if it is mine, I'll do as I see fit, but we won't live together. I do not forgive betrayal." She burst into tears on the phone, begging me to at least let her have a roof over her head until she gives birth. I refused and slammed the phone down loudly. Revenge was entering its final phase. I felt a nauseating intoxication from the awareness of my own superiority. I would sneak into Frank's yard when he wasn't there, documenting such violations as unstable foundations, piles of construction debris. I filmed on my camera, writing a complaint to the municipality. One night I almost set fire to his old shed, but at the last moment I realized that could lead to criminal charges, and prison was not in my plans. As the court date approached, I learned that Frank had fallen ill, perhaps with a nervous fever. He had tried to talk to me, sending messages like, "Robert, we must resolve this without mutual destruction. Dorothy is in a difficult position. She's suffering. Let's sit down together and find a compromise." I deleted his plaintive messages. No compromises. The court session didn't take very long. The judge issued a decree for separate living and ordered a paternity test. I obtained the legal right to evict her from my country house, and I did just that. Frank began to worry about a municipal meeting that threatened him with fines. Rumors about his affair with my wife spread beyond our neighborhood. He lost several clients who used to bring him equipment for repair. His financial stream dwindled. However, something happened that made me pause for a moment. Dorothy was hospitalized for stabilization. I saw her by chance when visiting an acquaintance who was a nurse. Dorothy stood in the corridor, slumped, her stomach slightly rounded. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face gaunt. She looked at me with despair. She didn't ask for anything, but I read in her expression a silent plea. I wanted to turn away, to pass by, and yet I stopped for a few seconds. "How did you end up here?" I asked. "I have blood pressure issues. They've put me on bed rest." She lowered her eyes to the floor. "Did you decide to finish me off for good?" "I'm doing what I consider just," I snapped, trying not to show any uncertainty. She whispered, "If the baby turns out to be yours, it's not his fault." I said nothing and just walked by. On my way home, I felt a distant shiver inside. I didn't know how to live if it turned out that the baby was mine. But my plan for revenge must not stop. I walked down the street, fists clenching in my pockets, trying to banish even a trace of pity. Finally, the day of the paternity test arrived. I submitted the samples and waited for the results. Frank also appeared, though he looked poor and haggard. Dorothy sat on a bench, her hands trembling. The doctor said it would take a week to analyze. Another week of tedious waiting. I persisted with my line, sending complaints about Frank, spreading rumors. He tried to brush it off. When the results came, everything fell into place. The child was Frank's. I remember looking at those printed letters in the laboratory. Dorothy stood by, crying, and Frank bowed his head. I said, "Now everything is clear. You are free to build your life, but I guarantee it will come at a bitter cost." As a final blow, I filed the divorce papers, leaving no chance for an out-of-court settlement. The court ruled in my favor, awarding Dorothy no payments from me, since the pregnancy wasn't connected to me. My lawyer did an excellent job. She ended up with practically nothing. She had no funds, and the house belonged to me. Frank was forced to take her in. But there was poverty, debt, and fear there. I stripped them of their peace, exhausting them physically, mentally, and financially. In the end, Frank sold his car to cover some fines and debts that arose after numerous inspections. Dorothy lived with him, in a state of deterioration, without the former comforts. My mission had been to trample on their happiness, and I had accomplished it. One evening, standing in my now deserted country house, I caught myself wondering, what next? I had destroyed their lives, plunged them into confusion and poverty. My wicked heart celebrated, but at the same time I felt a dark void inside. I had recently lost my marriage, shattering my illusions of fidelity, and disposed of the fate of an unborn child I would never see. But would I ever return to a normal existence? Part of me realized I had voluntarily stepped into an abyss. A few weeks later, I received a call saying that Dorothy had premature labor and that the baby was in critical condition. I silently hung up the phone. I didn't want to get involved. If the child survived, let them figure it out on their own. I wasn't obligated to save them. That was the end of it. I had exacted my revenge for the betrayal, shattered their lives, driven them into poverty, condemning them to a bitter existence. I had tossed the divorce papers in their faces and moved on from the past. On the last evening before I was to leave for the city, I sat on the porch of the country house. The autumn breeze tickled my graying hair, and a few sparse stars glimmered in the sky. I stared at the fence that separated our property from the neighbors. It seemed that this fence was now tall and impenetrable, a barrier between our lives. No one came anymore with cheerful laughter. No one brought tools. No one shared friendly jokes. I got up, walked over to the fence, and ran my hand along the old planks. For some reason I remembered how we used to happily drink coffee together, how we used to have joint picnics. Those moments were lost forever. I dug my nails into the rough surface of the board and whispered into the void, "It will be better this way." I got into my car and, without looking back, drove away from that cursed place. On the road my thoughts raced. Yes, my revenge had been accomplished. The marriage was dead, the friendship trampled, the lives of the traitors ruined. I was alone, but I had preserved my pride and my money. Perhaps a new chapter awaited me, where I would forget what had happened. Maybe someday I'd silence the memories of the betrayal. And I left the two of them to drown in their own mistakes. The end.